The story opens with an immediate crisis set in the sterile, bustling environment of an airport terminal. Naomi Tailor, heavily pregnant, is abandoned by her ex-husband, Marcus Wright, in front of the gate. As Naomi clutches her belly, visibly distressed, Marcus loudly rejects her, accusing her of scamming him and accusing her of manipulating him for money. The tension builds as Marcus's aggressive body language and venomous words echo through the terminal. The camera focuses on Naomi's vulnerable state, highlighting the danger to her pregnancy as Marcus's shout triggers a protective instinct from the audience. Naomi is emotionally crushed by the man who once claimed to love her, leaving her feeling helpless and rejected in a sea of strangers. But just as the situation seems dire, a calm and confident figure approaches from behind. Park Hyun-woo, a Korean Mafia boss, dressed sharply in a dark suit. The power dynamic shifts as Hyun-woo, accompanied by his security detail, asserts his presence without a word. He steps between Naomi and Marcus, silently asserting dominance, and the narrative takes a sharp turn as Marcus realizes he's no longer the one in control. The power gap between Naomi's fragile state and Park Hyun-woo's authority is immediate and jarring. The audience, left in suspense, now eagerly anticipates the reversal of power. The moment when Naomi's safety is no longer at the mercy of her ex-husband, but rather in the hands of a man who will protect her and her unborn child. Hello, family. Welcome to Afro Mafia Stories. Before we proceed to the story, I would love to know where you are watching from. Kindly drop it in the comments section and also subscribe to this channel. Now let's continue with the story. The airport terminal's harsh fluorescent lights blurred into a jagged, silver memory. The cold linoleum beneath Naomi's hands morphing into the rain-slicked pavement of a night she had tried so hard to bury. 10 months ago, the world hadn't been filled with the sterile scent of jet fuel and floor wax, but with the metallic tang of lightning and the suffocating aroma of expensive lilies in the Wright family estate. Naomi had stood in the center of their grand foyer, her 3-month pregnant belly barely a curve beneath her dress, facing a firing squad of elite indifference. Marcus hadn't looked at her then, just as he refused to truly see her now. He had stood behind his mother, a man carved from privilege who found his spine only when it was time to turn it against her. My son has a betrothed, a future that does not include a black foreigner and her trapped baby, Marcus's mother had hissed, her voice a whip that drew blood without ever touching skin. The rejection hadn't been a quiet conversation. It was an eviction of the soul. Marcus had watched with a terrifying, blank neutrality as his mother's security guards gripped Naomi's arms, the same arms that had once held him, and dragged her toward the massive oak doors. The memory slammed back with the force of a physical blow. Naomi could still feel the sudden, violent transition from the climate-controlled warmth of the mansion to the brutal reality of a Seoul monsoon. The doors had groaned shut, the heavy thud of the lock sounding like a gavel. "Stay down where you belong," the echo of the Wright family's disdain whispered through the rain. She had been 3 months pregnant, running blindly through the neon-blurred streets of Gangnam, her breath coming in ragged, sobbing hitches that burned her lungs. The rain was a solid wall, turning the world into a kaleidoscope of drowning lights. She had reached for her phone, her fingers numb and shaking, dialing Marcus's number over and over, praying for a glitch in the nightmare. But there was only the cold, automated click of a blocked line. He had erased her existence, while she was still carrying his legacy in her womb. The trauma of that night was a visceral symphony of terror. Her foot had slipped on the slick asphalt, and as she tumbled, the fear wasn't for her own life, but for the tiny heartbeat she was failing to protect. "Please let the baby be okay," she had whimpered into the storm, a prayer swallowed by the thunder. Then came the screeching of brakes, the high-pitched scream of tires fighting for grip on a flooded road. A black Mercedes had loomed out of the darkness, a mechanical predator missing her by mere inches. Naomi had collapsed onto the pavement, the freezing water pooling around her, feeling the first sharp, sickening twist of a pain that promised an end. The cramping had started almost instantly, a dull, rhythmic ache that signaled the beginning of the blood. Through the haze of her suicide-inducing grief, she had seen a door open. Strong arms, steady and radiating an impossible warmth, had reached into the chaos to pull her back from the edge of death. She remembered the scent of sandalwood and expensive tobacco cutting through the rain, and a voice, low, calm, and resonant, balking orders in Korean to a driver. She had woken up in the sterile white silence of Seoul National Hospital, the head of obstetrics herself hovering over her bed. But the news had been a second death. "I'm so sorry," the doctor had whispered. 3 hours of bleeding had claimed the son she was supposed to raise. She had miscarried at 14 weeks, lost in a sea of grief while Marcus was blocks away, celebrating a new engagement with a woman his mother deemed worthy. For months, Naomi had moved through the world like a ghost, rebuilding her life from the rubble, convinced that she was truly alone. She had buried her son in her heart and tried to forge a shield out of her scars. But now, standing in the airport terminal with Marcus's finger pointed at her like a weapon, the shield was cracking. "You probably lost my baby on purpose." Marcus's voice dripped with the same venom his mother had used 10 months ago. "You're just looking for another man to pay for your scam." The words hit like fists, more painful than the metal airport seating digging into her back. Naomi's face went white as the past and present collided. He didn't know that the man who had pulled her from the rain that night, the man who had held her while she bled out the life Marcus had discarded, was the same man currently walking through the terminal with lethal grace. Naomi clutched her 6-month belly, the daughter inside her kicking as if sensing the storm outside the airport windows. She looked past the man who had destroyed her toward the man who had saved her, realizing that the night it rained hadn't been the end of her story. It had been the foundation. The chaos of the airport terminal seemed to freeze as a low, rhythmic thrumming vibrated through the glass walls, drowning out the frantic chime of departure announcements. Marcus was still mid-sentence, his face contorted with a sneer as he prepared to launch another verbal assault, but his voice was swallowed by the sudden, heavy silence that swept over the crowd. Outside the terminal doors, a motorcade of black vehicles pulled up in a seamless, synchronized line, not just one or two, but a fleet of shadows that commanded the asphalt. The doors opened in perfect unison, and men in dark, sharp suits emerged like a coordinated wave of silence. At the center of the formation, moving with a lethal grace that made the air itself feel heavy, was Park Hyun-woo. He didn't run. He walked with the purposeful strides of a man who owned every inch of the ground he stepped on. His features were carved from stone, beautiful, terrifying, and completely devoid of the mercy Marcus had so carelessly expected. Marcus's hand, still pointed at Naomi in a domineering gesture, began to tremble as the gravity of the arrival set in. He looked at the men fanning out behind the chairman, a wall of professional intimidation that made the airport security guards hover uncertainly at the edges of the scene. The crowd stepped back instinctively, clearing a path as if moved by an invisible force. Hyun-woo's eyes, which had been fixed like black ice on the distance, found Naomi. In that instant, the rest of the terminal ceased to exist. He crossed the final distance in seconds, dropping beside her as she huddled on the cold floor, her hands still protectively shielding her belly. The transformation was jarring. The lethal predator disappeared, replaced by a man whose hands trembled as they hovered over her, afraid to cause further pain to the woman he had already pulled from the brink of death once before. "Sarang," he whispered in Korean, the word a soft anchor in the middle of the storm. He didn't wait for her to answer before he stood, his gaze shifting back to Marcus. With a fluid motion, Hyun-woo stripped off his heavy, tailored coat and draped it over Naomi's shaking shoulders. The scent of sandalwood and expensive tobacco instantly cocooning her in a safety she hadn't felt since the rain began 10 months ago. He turned to face Marcus then, and the air in the terminal turned to frost. Marcus tried to muster his previous bravado, his voice cracking as he stammered, "Do you know who I am? My family." "Your family means nothing here," one of Hyun-woo's men interrupted in accented English, his voice as sharp as a blade. Hyun-woo stepped closer to Marcus, looming over him with a calm confidence that made Marcus's rugged aggression look like the tantrum of a child. "You thought she was a scammer." Hyun-woo's voice remained pleasant, which somehow made it infinitely more terrifying. "You thought the woman you kicked was a nobody." I didn't know," Marcus gasped. his knees buckling as he sagged against the very luggage he had intended to use for his escape. "You didn't know that the pregnant woman you just assaulted is my wife?" Hyun-woo's question wasn't an inquiry. It was a promise of absolute consequences. He reached down, his fingers tracing the air near Marcus's throat without ever touching him, yet Marcus flinched as if struck. 10 months ago, you threw her away like garbage. Today, I am claiming what you were too foolish to keep." The terminal held its breath. There were no more shouts, no more accusations. There was only the sound of Naomi's steadying breath beneath the warmth of the chairman's coat, and the silent, terrifying realization in Marcus's eyes that he had finally encountered a force that couldn't be bought, bullied, or escaped. Hyun-woo leaned in, his voice a low, icy thread that only Marcus could hear. "I have wanted to meet the man who destroyed her. I suggest you start praying." The silence in the terminal was no longer empty. It was heavy, pressurized by the presence of a man who dealt in the currency of life and death. Marcus stood frozen, his face a pale mask of disbelief, as he looked from the towering figure of the chairman to the woman he had just labeled a scammer. The word hung in the air like a foul scent, and Park Hyun-woo seemed intent on burning it away. He didn't move toward Marcus with violence. Instead, Hyun-woo turned back to Naomi, his expression softening with a tenderness so profound it was more striking than his previous fury. He reached out, his long, scarred fingers gently brushing a stray curl from Naomi's face. When his hand descended, it didn't stop at her shoulder. With a reverence that silenced the few remaining whispers in the crowd, he placed his palm flat against the swell of her 6-month belly. Naomi let out a shuddering breath, her eyes closing as she leaned into his touch. The baby kicked, a sharp, insistent thrum against Hyun-woo's hand, and a ghost of a smile touched the chairman's lips. It was a private moment of recognition, a silent conversation between father and child that Marcus had no part in. "You called her a liar, Marcus Wright," Hyun-woo said, his voice dropping into a register that made the floorboards tremble. He didn't look up from Naomi's belly. "You told the world that she was looking for someone to pay for a child that wasn't yours. On that one point, and only that one, you were correct. This child is not yours. She never was." Marcus let out a forced, hysterical laugh. "I knew it. I told everyone. She's been sleeping around since the day she got to Seoul." The sound of a heavy metallic click cut him off. One of the bodyguards had moved, not to draw a weapon, but to reveal a tablet displaying a medical file, the seal of the Seoul National University Hospital bright and undeniable at the top. 10 months ago, you threw her into a storm," Hyun-woo continued, finally lifting his gaze. His eyes were void of heat, containing only the cold vacuum of space. "You and your mother watched her bleed on the pavement. You thought you had erased the problem. But the universe has a way of returning what is stolen. I was the one who found her. I was the one who held her while she mourned the son you let die." He stepped closer to Marcus, his shadow completely swallowing the smaller man. "And I was the one who stayed. Through the nightmares, through the rebuilding, through the long nights of her recovery. This child," he gestured to Naomi, who now stood tall, anchored by Hyun-woo's arm around her waist, "was conceived in love, not betrayal. She is a Park. She carries the blood of the man who saved her mother, not the coward who abandoned her." The revelation hit the terminal like a physical shockwave. The onlookers, who had initially watched with judgment, now looked at Marcus with a disgust that was palpable. He was no longer the wronged husband. He was the villain of a story that had outgrown him. "You see, Marcus," Hyun-woo leaned in, his voice a lethal whisper, "a man like you thinks power is about who you can push down. A man like me knows power is about who you can pull up. You didn't just reject a woman today, you rejected the only mercy you were ever going to receive." He signaled to his lead bodyguard, Tai Hyun. "The chairman's daughter will not be born while her mother's name is stained by this filth. Start the process. I want the Wright family's holdings audited. Every debt, every hidden account, every shadow they've crawled into. If he wants to talk about scams, let's show him what a real investigation looks like." Naomi looked up at Hyun-woo, the fear that had clouded her eyes for months finally beginning to evaporate. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was the protected queen of a man who would burn the world down to keep her warm. As Hyun-woo began to lead her toward the exit, his hand never leaving her back, he paused beside Marcus one last time. My daughter is already more of a person than you will ever be, Hyun-woo said quietly. And unlike you, she will never have to wonder what it feels like to be loved. With a final, dismissive glance, the chairman walked away. Behind them, the security detail closed ranks, a wall of black suits that cut Marcus off from the woman he had lost. The airport doors hissed open, and as the cool air of the morning hit them, Naomi felt the baby kick again. A small, fierce pulse of life that belonged entirely to the future, and not at all to the man left trembling in the terminal. The black-tinted windows of the Cadillac Escalade swallowed the airport's chaotic lights, replacing them with the soft, amber glow of the vehicle's interior. Naomi sat tucked against Hyun-woo's side, the heavy wool of his coat still draped over her shoulders like a shield. She watched the terminal fade into the distance, but her mind was still trapped in the sound of Marcus's voice, the casual cruelty of a man who thought he was untouchable. Hyun-woo didn't speak, but his hand remained firmly over hers, his thumb tracing slow, rhythmic circles over her knuckles. It was the silent promise of a man who had already moved 3 steps ahead of the enemy. In the front seat, Tai Hyun, the lead investigator and Hyun-woo's most trusted shadow, tapped a glass screen, sending a series of encrypted files to the center console's display. The interior of the car transformed into a mobile war room. "Chairman," Tai Hyun's voice was clinical, devoid of emotion. "We didn't just find the debts. We found the ghost Marcus Wright thought he had laid to rest 2 years ago." Naomi looked up, her breath hitching as a grainy, blue-tinted video began to play on the screen. It was dashcam footage, dated 24 months prior. The timestamp showed it was 3 in the morning. The location was a quiet industrial stretch on the outskirts of Seoul. On the screen, a white sports car, a limited edition model Naomi recognized from Marcus's old social media posts, was swerving violently across the yellow lines. "He was coming from a private club in Gangnam," Tai Hyun explained, his eyes fixed on the data scrolling beside the video. "Blood toxicity reports we intercepted from a private clinic show he was heavily under the influence of cocaine and premium whiskey. He wasn't just driving, he was flying." The video jolted. A figure appeared in the headlights, a man on a delivery scooter, a father working the graveyard shift to provide for his family. The impact was sickeningly silent on the muted footage. The white car didn't stop. It didn't brake. It accelerated, leaving a twisted heap of metal and a dying man in its wake. Naomi pressed her hand to her mouth, her eyes stinging. "He told me he sold that car because he wanted something more sensible for our future," she whispered. The irony felt like ash in her throat. "He sold it to a scrapyard owned by a shell company his father controlled," Hyun-woo said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that vibrated through Naomi's shoulder. But Marcus was sloppy. He forgot that the car's internal hard drive recorded the crash data, and he forgot about the witness he paid to take the fall. The screen split. On one side was the crash. On the other was a mugshot of a man named Park Dong-min, a desperate, low-level employee at the Wright's logistics firm whose mother needed expensive heart surgery. "The Wright family paid for the surgery," Tai Hyun continued. "In exchange, Dong-min confessed to being the driver of a company vehicle involved in an accident. He's been sitting in a cell for 2 years for a murder Marcus committed." Hyun-woo reached out and paused the video on a frame showing Marcus's face through the driver's side window, illuminated by a street lamp seconds after the hit. His expression wasn't one of horror or regret. It was one of pure, panicked selfishness. The same expression he'd worn at the airport when he pushed Naomi. "He thought money could bury the dead," Hyun-woo said, finally turning his gaze to Naomi. The coldness in his eyes was gone, replaced by a fierce, protective light. "He thought he could discard people like trash, that delivery driver, the man in prison, and you. He built his life on a foundation of broken bodies." "What happens now?" Naomi asked, her voice gaining a strength that surprised even her. Hyun-woo looked back at the screen, and for a moment, the chairman returned, the man who governed an empire where loyalty was rewarded and betrayal was a death sentence. "Now, we don't just take his money, we take his freedom. We give the truth back to the man in that cell, and we give the delivery driver's family the justice they were denied." Tai Hyun nodded, his fingers flying across the tablet. The files are being mirrored to the prosecutor general's private server as we speak. By the time Marcus reaches his hotel, the gates will already be closing. His father's influence ends where my evidence begins. Hyun-woo pulled Naomi closer, his chin resting atop her head. He pushed you because he thought you were alone, Naomi. He's about to find out that the woman he rejected is the one who will bring his entire world crashing down. As the car sped through the heart of the city, Naomi looked out at the glowing skyline. For the first time in 10 months, the weight in her chest didn't feel like grief. It felt like the slow, rising heat of a fire that was finally going to burn the right things. The dashcam footage looped one last time on the screen, a silent witness to a crime that was no longer a secret. The hunt had officially begun. The silence in the Wright family boardroom was far more suffocating than the humid air of the airport terminal had been. It was a silence born of cold calculations and the heavy scent of old money. Marcus stood at the end of the long mahogany table, his casual jacket now rumpled and damp with sweat, looking like a common intruder in the temple of his own heritage. Across from him, his father, Arthur Wright, sat motionless, his face a mask of granite under the soft glow of the crystal chandelier. "The evidence is absolute, Marcus," Arthur said, his voice a low, rhythmic drone that lacked even a spark of fatherly concern. He didn't look at his son. Instead, he stared at the digital tablet lying between them, where the dashcam footage of the hit-and-run remained paused on Marcus's panicked face. "Park Hyun-woo didn't just send us a file. He sent us an ultimatum. Either we hand you over to the authorities ourselves, or he systematically dismantles every subsidiary, every shell company, and every offshore account the Wright family has spent 3 generations building." Marcus let out a short, hysterical bark of a laugh. "You're actually considering this? Dad, I'm your only son. He's a criminal, a glorified mobster. You can buy the prosecutors. We've done it before. We did it for the delivery driver." Arthur finally looked up, and the sheer emptiness in his eyes made Marcus stumble back. "We bought a shadow for a delivery driver, Marcus. We cannot buy our way out of a war with a man who owns the very light the shadows hide in. Hyun-woo has already frozen our logistics contracts in Incheon. Our stock price is plummeting because of rumors his people are feeding to the press. He isn't asking for money. He is asking for a sacrifice." The weight of the word, sacrifice, hung in the air like a guillotine. Marcus's aggressive posture, the one he had used to domineer Naomi at the gate, collapsed entirely. He looked toward the door, where 2 of the family's own security details stood, but they didn't look at him with the usual deference. They looked at him as if he were already a ghost. "I did everything for this family," Marcus whispered, his voice cracking. "I rejected that girl. I let Mother throw her out so I wouldn't ruin our reputation with a scandal. I did exactly what you raised me to do, put the name first." "And now," Arthur said, standing up with a slow, agonizing dignity, "you will do it one last time. You will put the name first by removing yourself from it." He slid a fountain pen across the table toward a single sheet of paper, a formal disinheritance and a confession of the hit-and-run. "If you sign this, I will ensure your mother is taken care of. If you don't, we all go down together, and I will not allow the Wright empire to burn for a son who was too sloppy to hide his own sins." The betrayal was a physical coldness that seeped into Marcus's bones. He realized then that he was truly alone. Naomi had been claimed by a man who would move mountains for her, while he was being discarded by the man who had given him life. The irony was a bitter, choking salt in his throat. He looked at the pen, then at the door, and finally at the father who was already turning his back on him to answer a business call. "The police are in the lobby," Arthur said into the phone, his tone clinical. "Yes, he's ready. We are cooperating fully. The Wright family has always stood for justice." Marcus's hand trembled as he reached for the pen. As he scratched his name onto the parchment, the image of Naomi at the airport, wrapped in the chairman's coat, protected and cherished, flashed through his mind. He had thought he was the one with the power to reject. He had thought he was the one who could decide who stayed and who went. But as the heavy doors of the boardroom opened to reveal the waiting detectives, Marcus Wright finally understood the truth. He hadn't rejected Naomi. He had merely freed her to be loved by a man who was everything he could never be. The security guards stepped forward, their grip on his arms firm and unyielding, mirroring the way he had once shoved Naomi. But this time, there was no motorcade waiting to save him. There was only the long, cold walk to a cell and the silence of a father who didn't even turn around to watch him go. The heavy iron gates of Anyang Correctional Institution groaned open with a rhythmic, mechanical finality that signaled the end of a long, cold winter for Park Dong-min. For 2 years, he had lived within a world of gray concrete and stolen sunlight, a living sacrifice for a crime he hadn't committed. As he stepped across the threshold, the air outside felt impossibly light, carrying the faint scent of rain and the distant hum of a city that had forgotten him. He was thinner than when he went in, his shoulders slightly hunched as if still braced for a blow, but his eyes were clear. In his hand, he clutched a small envelope containing his discharge papers, a formal declaration of innocence that felt like a shield against the ghosts of the past. He looked up at the sky, squinting against the pale afternoon sun, and for a moment, the weight of the 2 years he had lost threatened to pull him down. A black sedan sat idling a few yards away, its engine a low, respectful purr. As Dong-min approached, the passenger door opened and Tae Hyun stepped out. The lead investigator didn't say a word. He simply bowed his head in a gesture of profound respect, a silent apology from a world that had failed Dong-min until now. "The chairman sends his regards," Tae Hyun said quietly, opening the back door. "Everything is ready. Your mother is waiting." The drive through the city was a blur of neon and movement. Dong-min watched the world rush by, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had spent 700 nights dreaming of this moment, terrified that time would run out before he could see her face again. He knew the cost of his freedom. He knew that the Wright family's empire was crumbling, and that the man who had truly killed that delivery driver was now sitting in the very cell he had just vacated. But none of that mattered compared to the woman waiting at the end of this journey. The car pulled up to a quiet, private medical facility on the outskirts of Seoul, a place far more dignified than the public wards Dong-min had once feared his mother would die in. Tae Hyun led him through the hushed hallways to a sun-drenched room at the end of the corridor. Inside, the air smelled of citrus and fresh linen. A woman sat in a wheelchair by the window, a knitted shawl over her fragile shoulders. She looked smaller than he remembered, her hair a softer shade of silver, but when she turned at the sound of the door, the spark in her eyes was unmistakable. "Dong-min." Her voice was a fragile thread, trembling with a hope she had been afraid to voice for 2 years. "Amma," he choked out, the word breaking into a sob. He fell to his knees beside her chair, burying his face in her lap just as he had as a child. Her hands, thin and marked by the IV lines that had kept her alive, came up to stroke his hair. She didn't ask how he was free. She didn't ask about the Wrights or the chairman or the lawyers. She simply held him, her tears dampening the fabric of his cheap release jacket. "I knew," she whispered, her voice gaining a sudden, fierce strength. "I told them every night. My son is a good man. My son would never leave someone in the road." Across the room, standing in the shadows of the doorway, Park Hyun-woo watched the reunion in silence. Beside him, Naomi stood with her hand resting on her belly, her eyes wet with tears of cathartic joy. She looked at Dong-min, a man she had never met until today, and saw the reflection of her own salvation. They were both survivors of the Wright family's wreckage, salvaged from the storm by the same steady hand. Hyun-woo reached out, taking Naomi's hand and lacing his fingers with hers. He didn't need to speak. The scene before them was the only reward he required. By freeing Dong-min, he hadn't just corrected a legal error, he had restored a soul. The mafia boss the world feared was, in this room, merely a man who understood that true power wasn't found in the lives you took, but in the families you stitched back together. As Dong-min lifted his head to smile at his mother, the late afternoon sun caught the tears on his face, turning them into streaks of light. The debt was paid. The innocent was home. And for the first time in 2 years, the shadows over Seoul felt just a little bit thinner. The walls of the Seoul Detention Center were a suffocating, uniform gray that seemed to absorb light and sound alike. For Marcus Wright, the world had shrunk from the sprawling marble halls of his family estate to a 6-by-9-foot box that smelled of damp concrete and industrial-grade detergent. The aggressive, domineering man who had shouted at the airport was gone, replaced by a hollow-eyed ghost in a drab orange jumpsuit. His messy hair had been buzzed short, and the rugged confidence he once wore like armor had been stripped away by the cold reality of a 15-year sentence. The heavy steel slot in the door groaned, a sound that usually signaled another tray of lukewarm rice, but instead, a single cream-colored envelope slid onto the floor. It looked impossibly elegant against the grime of the cell. Marcus stared at it for a long time, his heart hammering against his ribs. He recognized the handwriting. It wasn't the frantic, shaky script of the girl he had abandoned in the rain. It was the steady, graceful hand of a woman who had found her peace. With trembling fingers, Marcus tore the seal. The scent of sandalwood and a hint of lavender drifted from the paper, a sensory ghost of a life he had forfeited. Marcus, the letter began, the name looking like a stranger on the page. I am writing this because I realize that as long as I carry the weight of what you did, I am still a prisoner, too. And I have worked too hard to be free. Marcus sank onto the thin mattress of his cot, the paper crinkling in his grip. For 10 months, I woke up every morning with the phantom pain of the son we lost. I blamed you. I blamed your mother. I blamed the rain. I carried that anger like a shield, thinking it would protect me from ever being hurt again. But anger is a heavy burden, Marcus. It's a poison that kills the person carrying it, not the one it's aimed at. He closed his eyes, the memory of the airport terminal flashing through his mind. He remembered the way he had pointed his finger at her, the venomous words he'd spat about scams and black girls. He remembered the look of pure, agonizing hurt in Naomi's eyes just before the chairman arrived. I want you to know that I forgive you, the letter continued. I forgive you for the night you let your family chase me into traffic. I forgive you for not answering when I called from the hospital while I was losing our child. I forgive you for every cruel word you said at the airport. But you must understand, forgiveness is not the same as an escape. My forgiveness is for me, so I can be the mother my daughter deserves. The consequences you are facing now, those belong to you. You are in that cell because you killed a man and stole 2 years of life from an innocent one. That is a debt you owe to the world, not to me. A hot, stinging tear tracked through the stubble on Marcus's cheek, falling onto the paper. I used to wonder why this happened to me, Naomi wrote, but now I know. If you hadn't left me, I never would have found the man who truly saw me. If you hadn't pushed me at the airport, the truth about your crimes would have stayed buried forever. In your attempt to destroy me, you accidentally saved so many others. I hope these years give you time to find a version of yourself that doesn't need to hurt people to feel powerful. I have found my purpose. I have found my family. I have found myself. Be well, Marcus. This is the last time I will speak your name. Marcus read the final line, Naomi Tailor Park, and felt a jagged piece of his soul finally break. He folded the paper carefully, his hands shaking so violently he could barely align the edges. He tucked it under his thin pillow, the only thing of value he owned in this cold, concrete world. For the first time since his arrest, Marcus didn't feel the urge to pace or scream at the guards or demand a lawyer his father would never send. He leaned his head against the cold wall and wept. He didn't cry for his lost wealth or his ruined reputation. He cried for the woman who was now a queen in another man's kingdom, and for the realization that the scam he had accused her of was actually the only real love he had ever been offered. Outside the high, barred window, the sun was setting over Seoul, but inside the cell, Marcus Wright was finally beginning the long, silent work of living with himself. The sterile, frightening hallways of Naomi's past had been replaced by the soft, honeyed light of the Park Estate's private medical wing. Here, there were no cold linoleum floors or the indifferent gazes of those who saw her as a burden. Instead, the air was filled with the faint scent of jasmine and the steady, grounding presence of Park Hyun-woo. The labor had been a journey of its own, a final bridge between the woman Naomi had been, the one pushed at the airport, and the woman she was becoming. Each contraction felt like the breaking of an old chain, a shedding of the fear that had defined her for so long. Through the hours of pain, Hyun-woo never left her side. His hand was a constant, solid weight in hers, his voice a low, steady anchor that kept her from drifting into the dark memories of the night it rained. He didn't look at her with the pity she had once received from others. He looked at her with a fierce, unwavering devotion that made her feel invincible even in her most vulnerable moments. When the first cry finally broke the silence of the room, it wasn't a sound of distress, but a clear, melodic proclamation of life. It was a sound that seemed to rewrite Naomi's entire history. "It's a girl, Naomi," Hyun-woo whispered, his own voice thick with an emotion he rarely allowed the world to see. A nurse placed the tiny, warm bundle against Naomi's chest. The baby was perfect, a beautiful blend of her mother's resilient spirit and her father's quiet strength. She had a dusting of dark hair and tiny, grasping fingers that immediately curled around Naomi's thumb. In that moment, the airport terminal, the Wright family, and the gray walls of the prison cell vanished. There was only the rhythmic rise and fall of her daughter's chest, and the overwhelming peace that comes when a storm finally gives way to the sun. They named her Hana, meaning one or first, a testament to the new legacy they were building together. A week later, the peace deepened as Naomi settled into their home, a sanctuary nestled in the hills overlooking the city. It was a house filled with light, where the windows didn't rattle in the wind and the doors were never locked against her. She spent her afternoons in the nursery, a room bathed in soft pastels and filled with the tiny onesies that had once been scattered like snow across a mall floor. Now they were folded neatly, symbols of a life that was organized by love rather than chaos. Hyun-woo joined her as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of violet and gold. He stood behind her, his arms wrapping around her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder as they both watched Hana sleep in her crib. There was no need for the dark suits or the intimidating security detail here. In the quiet of their home, he was simply a husband and a father, the man who had seen a woman drowning in a storm and decided to build her an ocean of her own. "She looks just like you when she sleeps," Hyun-woo murmured, his breath warm against her skin. Naomi leaned back into his strength, her heart fuller than she ever thought possible. She thought of Marcus, sitting in his cold cell, and felt a final, fleeting wave of gratitude, not for his cruelty, but for the fact that his rejection had been the very thing that led her to this porch, this man, and this peace. The fear that had lived in the marrow of her bones for 10 months was gone, replaced by a profound, shimmering sense of belonging. As the first stars began to appear over Seoul, Naomi Tailor Park realized that her daughter's first breath had been her own second chance. The world was still out there, with its noise and its shadows, but inside these walls, the silence was finally kind. She was no longer running, she was home. The morning sun glistened off the sleek glass and warm cedar accents of the newly finished building in the heart of Seoul. It was a structure that didn't look like an institution, it looked like a promise. Above the main entrance, elegant silver lettering caught the light, "The Second Chance's Home." Naomi stood behind the heavy velvet curtain of the auditorium, her fingers tracing the smooth wood of the podium she was about to occupy. She was no longer the woman in the light blue button-up shirt clutching her belly in an airport terminal, nor was she the ghost of a girl running through a monsoon. Today, she wore a structured suit of cream silk, her hair styled in a crown of braids that mirrored the regal strength she had found within herself. Beside her, Park Hyun-woo adjusted his cufflinks, his dark suit impeccable, his presence as steady as the mountain she had learned to lean on. He didn't offer her words of encouragement. He didn't need to. He simply placed a hand on the small of her back, a gesture that said, "I am here, but this stage is yours." In his other arm, he cradled Hana, who was fast asleep, oblivious to the fact that her mother was about to change the world for women who looked just like them. As the curtains parted, the flash of cameras and the soft murmur of the crowd filled the room. Representatives from the city, activists, and, most importantly, rows of women who had once felt invisible looked up at her. Naomi took a deep breath, the scent of fresh flowers on the stage grounding her. 365 days ago, Naomi began, her voice clear and resonant, carrying to the very back of the hall. I was standing at an airport gate, convinced that my life had reached its final departure. I was told I was a scammer. I was told I was a burden. I was told that because I was a foreigner and because I was alone, I had no right to the child I was carrying. She paused, her gaze sweeping over the audience, stopping momentarily on a young woman in the third row who was holding her own small suitcase, her eyes wide with a familiar fear. I learned that day that rock bottom isn't just a place of despair, Naomi continued, her voice softening but gaining a steel-like edge. It is a foundation. When you are stripped of everything, your home, your dignity, your safety, you are left with the only thing that cannot be taken, your truth. I stand here today not because I was saved by a man, though love is a powerful healer. I stand here because I chose to believe my truth over the lies shouted at me in a terminal. She gestured to the building around them. The Second Chance's home is not just a shelter. It is a sanctuary for the rejected. It is a place where being thrown into the rain is not the end of the story, but the beginning of the transformation. Here, we provide the legal aid, the medical care, and the community that the world tries to deny us. We are turning the stones thrown at us into the walls of our own kingdom. The room was silent, the kind of silence that precedes a shift in the atmosphere. Naomi looked at Hyun-woo, who watched her with a pride so fierce it was almost tangible. She thought of Marcus, whose name she hadn't spoken in months, and felt a final, distant sense of closure. His attempt to bury her had only resulted in her taking root. To every woman here who has been told she is someone else's problem, Naomi concluded, her eyes shining with a calm, triumphant light, look at this building, look at me, and know that you are not a problem to be solved. You are a force to be reckoned with. Welcome home. As the room erupted into a standing ovation, Naomi stepped away from the podium. She didn't look at the cameras or the dignitaries. She walked straight to Hyun-woo, taking their daughter into her arms. The baby stirred, opening her eyes to see a world that her mother had made safer, kinder, and infinitely more beautiful. Walking out of the auditorium and into the bright light of the lobby, Naomi didn't look back. The Second Chance wasn't just a building. It was the breath in her lungs, the warmth of the man beside her, and the bright, unwritten future of the child in her arms. She had turned her rock bottom into a foundation, and on that ground she was finally, undeniably, free. Naomi did the unthinkable by forgiving Marcus from his prison cell. Would you have the strength to forgive someone who caused you so much pain, or would you have let him rot in silence? Let's talk about it in the comments below. I read every single one. Also like and subscribe to this channel for more amazing stories. Don't let the shadows of your past dim the light of your future. Until next time, stay strong and stay beautiful.